So I might get started by welcoming you all to this last CRADLE seminar of 2023. And what a cracker we have to finish off what's been, I'd say, an exhausting year. I don't know about anyone else. It's been very exciting, but very full. And what a great way to finish with this seminar. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the country, the traditional lands on which I am, and I'm on the lands of the Boonwurrung people here at home. Deakin itself covers Wurundjeri country, Boonwurrung country, Eastern Maar country, and I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past, present and future, and I note that the land has never been ceded. So and that's, that acknowledgement of country is such a segue into a talk titled The Politics of Belonging, I think. So I feel really lucky to be able to give this sort of introductory remarks. I think this is a really exciting seminar that we have planned. And now I'm struggling to find my notes as well as where I was, because that's how this whole day has gone. And I'm going to just leave that. I'm now going to completely do this by memory. So everyone is going to have to bear with me and correct the momentary bios that I'm going to give you from my without any notes at all. So it's absolutely been one of those technological days. Politics of belonging, super exciting. Different ways of thinking about belonging. Belonging is such a big term in higher education today. People talk about it a lot, but perhaps we've just become a little uncritical. And who better to share research that has happened into this space than our three speakers. It's based on a grant funded by the Society for Research in Higher Education in the UK, thus the 11-hour time difference. And our presenters today are I'll do them, I think, in the order of how they'll be speaking. Dr. Karen Gravitt from the University of Surrey, who is a wonderful and exciting researcher with interests in relational ways of understanding the world, and a very fine interest in the socio-material as well too. Professor Sarah O'Shea, who's at Charles Sturt University, whose reputation in the area of equity and understanding how we can make things better for our diverse body of students is probably needs no introduction at all. And I think you have some sort of dean title, Sarah, that is, as I don't have my notes in front of me, I don't recall, but it's in your notes, people. And finally, my dear colleague, Professor Rollo Jawi from CRADLE, who is also stellar in this field, and I know has had a personal interest in the ideas of belonging for a long time. So enough from me. I'm going to pass over to, I think, Karen now to take us through this seminar. Order of the day, sorry, now I'm remembering housekeeping. Order of the day, we're going to have a talk. We'll take formal questions. Please use the Q&A for questions. Use a chat to chat with each other. Upvote in the Q&A. We'll take as many as we can within the hour. I'll bring the whole thing to a close formally at the hour. And if there's interest and energy, we'll continue on up into another half an hour in a slightly more informal way. Having said that, over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Margaret. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us this evening or this morning to think together about this, as Margaret said, this really huge topic at the moment, the politics of student belonging, storying through words and images. And we want to share our research with you and our thinking about this topic and think with you about your thoughts on it as well. Okay, so perfect. Okay, so this morning, this evening, as I said, I'm going to talk to you about our research and our interest in this huge topic on student belonging in higher education. And we started thinking about this together, perhaps maybe about 3 years ago. And when we came to do this research, we noticed in the literature that there's just been this really fascinating burgeoning of interest in the topic recently, which I'm sure many of you will also be aware of. So this slide, for example, shows us the huge increase in discussions about the concept of belonging in higher education. This references Web of Science publications from the 1990s onwards. And we're thinking, what is this? Why is everybody so interested and fascinated about this thorny, amorphous notion of belonging? And I think partly it's to do with our concerns and interests following COVID, following the post-pandemic, our awareness, our acute awareness about the changes that the pandemic wrought to our relationships and the ways in which we feel connected with each other, with our students, how our students might feel disconnected from their university or the world. It's also perhaps a cumulative effect. In education, we love to embrace new ideas and talk about them together, and that can generate new interest. But also, I think it's inevitably interconnected with this idea of how we can foster inclusivity and how we can respond to our increasingly diverse student populations, which is a real concern for many of us, many educators interested in fostering inclusivity and greater social justice. So we were thinking about this, but at the same time, we were also really thinking, and perhaps, being honest, a little bit troubled by some of the discourses and conversations that are increasingly happening around the concept of belonging. As I've tried to suggest, for us, belonging is a really knotty, nuanced, mobile concept. But increasingly, we were aware that the discourses of belonging were perhaps, recurrently evolving around ideas of students who were quite depicted as quite culturally specific, quite normative conceptions of what a student was like. You will all no doubt be familiar, I'm quite confident that you'll be familiar with this term, a sense of belonging. It's really everywhere, and even as staff, we're asked in our survey, do we feel a sense of belonging? But really, I'm wondering whether any of us could actually agree upon and define a singular sense of belonging and how we would understand or explain that. So we were kind of interested in that singular notion, that sense of belonging that seems to be almost taken for granted as something that we have a shared understanding of. So we were also a little bit troubled by the connections between belonging and discussions of retention, achievement, and again, this singular definition of what it might mean to be successful at university. So there's very much discussions around belonging being something that can somehow be achieved, can somehow be fixed and finite, and even possible to measure, perhaps even quantitatively. At the same time, we were interested in thinking about belonging as something, much more unstable and difficult to define. So even thinking about belonging as something affective, an affective atmosphere, that feeling of effect, that sensation of effect that you can experience sometimes as a sense of, or multiple senses of belonging or non-belonging. So we were very interested to unpack, and as Margaret said, take a critical view to thinking about belonging. We were also interested in thinking about whether belonging, I've gone too fast, sorry, my slides are a bit slow. Let me try and go back. About belonging as something overly positive. So we always talk about belonging as something that we want to strive to, and naturally, and this is something that we do want to think about, of course, it's really important that we think about this. In the literature, we know that student belonging can be connected with feeling accepted, respected, valued. Strayhorn, for example, talks about belonging as feeling or sensation of connectedness, the experience of mattering and feeling cared for. Thomas's fantastic work talks about how we can think about positive self-perceptions of social acceptance within the institution. These are really important ideas to think about. But at the same time, is belonging always a positive experience? We really wanted to trouble the boundaries of belonging and thinking about whether belonging is always uniformly experienced, whether it's inherently positive, and whether, as I said, whether it's something that we can ever fix or fully achieve in any finite or concrete way, as has been suggested. So we were interested in thinking about the complexity of belonging. And I love this quote by Jan MacArthur. She talks about how we might move the debate on the inclusive university forward by not seeking to simplify it through definition, but by embracing its complexity through contested ideas. So this idea of embracing the complexity of the concepts that we engage to really think through all the nuances of this idea. So we were interested then about thinking about how belonging is not necessarily location specific. Perhaps learners don't necessarily want to belong to a particular location or even to a whole university. And we really wanted to trouble this generalized sort of one size fits all idea of belonging, thinking about whether sometimes, even with the best of intentions, our work as educators, if it uses and adopts simplified conceptions of a term, could actually lead to feelings of exclusion as opposed to what we're really trying to achieve, which is, of course, greater inclusion and equity. So we came to the conclusion that belonging is inherently complex and political. Having some sticky slide issues. Thank you. So we were interested in thinking about belonging as a practice and a product of the relations of power embedded in the field of higher education, and moving the concept away from the constructions that it has been typically around identities of typical or authentic students. So Thomas's work has explored how often when we think about belonging, we think about it being that typical student, that on-campus student who can engage in extracurricular activities, who can engage in clubs and societies. Rather, we wanted to think about belonging as an ongoing process of negotiation. And I love Kelly Guillot and colleagues' work here, who talk about this idea of belonging being mobile and evolving and fluid. We also draw on ideas from Yuso Niemanen and colleagues, who talk about how actually for some students deliberately choosing not to belong is really important, and it can be a purposeful act of resistance and non-identification. And I think that's something that hasn't been spoken about enough, where non-belonging as an active choice can actually be a really helpful idea. So thinking through these ideas led us to start our work into exploring this really complex area. And the first thing that Rola and I did was draw together our thinking and engage some theory, so some spatial theories and some posthuman theories, to think about and conceptualize belonging as a situated practice. So something that students and teachers might experience in specific situations, something that might be very, very fluid, that might evolve, that might be processual. So something that we experience in process. We wanted to think about belonging as a practice, as something that develops and changes in connection to different spaces, different times, and different relational connections, in order to think through what this sort of more complex, more nuanced approach might enable us to do. This is very much not just a theoretical exercise, but really thinking about what this might enable us to do as educators in order to enrich the work that we do with students, and understanding the real multiplicity of their experiences and the ways in which students learn in universities, so that we can really head forward with our work supporting belonging in a really generative way that doesn't simplify or exclude. So we started this exercise, as I did, with this theoretical conceptual paper, Belonging as Situated Practice, prior to the research that we're going to share with you today. But we were also really inspired by this fantastic paper by Sarah, who's obviously here with us today, and her colleague Janine. And in this paper, if you haven't come across it yet, there's a really wonderful reconceptualization, a problematization of the concept of student success. Again, a little bit like belonging, just looking at the depths and the nuances of how we might understand the concept of success in multiple plural ways, and crucially what that enables us then to do. So we were interested in how, just like with success, we might problematize the way belonging has been understood in order to understand it again in a more generative way. And crucially, what we drew from this study was thinking about how students conceptualize these concepts. So as educators, we love to talk about these ideas, don't we? We talk about them, we come to wonderful talks like this, and we read papers, and we go to conferences, and we talk about them in our institutions. But what we thought was really, really crucial was to hear and to engage with students through their words, through their stories, through their images. And we'll talk about the vlogs that we use to listen and to see students' own conceptions, to really think about how students were interpreting this concept of belonging and what their interpretations could bring to the conversation. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to continue with the research that we did. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Karen. And thank you for that lovely introduction as well, Margaret. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm seated at the moment, the Wiradjuri people. I've just travelled over from Ngunnawal country to Wiradjuri country. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we managed to get this research happening. And as Karen mentioned, we came to this really from the perspective of what students thought. So we were very keen to make sure that students' perspectives were very much embedded in what we were going to do. And we were fortunate enough to get funding from the Society for Research in Higher Education. And the project was called Belonging to and Beyond Higher Education in Hybrid Spaces. Again, because it was post-COVID, or literally not quite post-COVID, but very close to COVID, I think SRHE were very interested in this idea of exploring belonging, particularly as universities emerged from that sort of lockdown. And we wanted to really unpack the ways that students' experiences in creating belonging within the contemporary university, but also to look at their experiences of belonging and non-belonging, and so how they might have done that as well through hybrid or more blended approaches to learning. So click to start. I can't move it along. Rola won't let me. Thanks, Rola. So as I mentioned, we talked about what students, we wanted to look at what students' day-to-day interactions look like. How do students create belonging? And we were keen to do that from very much a student's perspective. So as well as the traditional ways of collecting data through interviews, we also invited students to make vlogs, which are video blogs, to sort of tell us what belonging meant to them in their day-to-day lives. And so these vlogs were fascinating. And we then accompanied these with interviews so that we could unpack further what that belonging meant and how it was manifested. And then it undertook some reflexive thematic analysis. So as you can imagine, the combination of the visual and the narrative really started to give us some insights into the complexity of this concept. So next slide, please, Rola. So some of the prompts that we use for the vlogs, we asked students really to keep them relatively short, but we provided them with questions and conversation starters so that they could sort of focus what they were doing. So some of the questions that we asked were, tell us what a typical day of study might look like for you. Tell or show us your learning spaces. Where did they study? How did they construct that learning space? How did that learning space convey belonging or unbelonging, as the case may be? And to really explore, on a very personal level, what belonging looked and felt like in these spaces, as well as considering, what others help these students to belong to the course in the university. And the others could be, obviously other people on their program of study, but equally might be family members, a broad diversity of different people who combined helped in this creation of belonging, or not, as the case may be. So our guiding question, though, really our overarching question was, who can belong, how, and to where? But we really wanted to reflect on other questions as well. And so when we were conducting analysis, we were really doing that with these questions in mind. What are we wanting students to belong to? Why? When might belonging be undesirable? What does belonging do? What does it make possible? How might it constrain? And we had many late night UK, Australia Zoom conversations around this. And it was a really generative project, one that I refer to this one as my passion project, because it really evoked a lot of thinking on all our parts. What we found is that engagement is often, as Karen mentioned, is often defined in quite one-dimensional ways, and we assume a certain type of learner. But what the students told us and showed us in these vlogs was that it was really mobile and multiple, and that they purposefully went out and curated their own belonging. It was very personal. And they were often engaged in multiple communities, and they had varying levels of belonging or unbelonging depending on where they were positioned. And that often this might trouble the boundaries of space, campus, and belonging. So a lot of the times the interviews and the vlogs challenged us in our perspectives of what belonging should look like. And we really enjoyed that challenge. Not surprisingly, I'm sure, making connections was a very strong theme in the data. And it was often these connections that was how students made sense of belonging. And I won't read these out, but you can see both Lee and Nat in their vlogs. They talk about, being in class or, being with peers that were doing the same thing as them. And all of that helped them feel this sense of belonging. But there was also some barriers to connection as well. As this student indicates, that for her, it was the unit chair not answering. And, we found this quite interesting because having a connection to just one person seemed important for some students, not all. So Layla sort of judged her sense of belonging according to the nature and volume of communication that she received. And if students are measuring their belonging to the university, on this sort of criteria, this clearly has implications for how universities might manage, for example, large numbers of students, many of which are studying in blended or online environments. And so perhaps highlighting the need for frequent touch points, however they might be. And Also, we found that, this was more than simply about just connecting with one person, but it was also about feeling part of a larger community. Belonging was measured by facilitated approaches to forming deep and meaningful connections with the university as a whole as well. Importantly, in many cases, this needed to be scaffolded in some way by the institution, but in quite purposeful ways that were not just tokenistic, but actually really meaningful, as opposed to some sort of busy work. And these are just some examples of the ways that students really felt that, that more proactive generation of belonging could be created. For Claire, it was, the Students as Partners program, and Imran talks about a subject that, that it has that, you get really engaged and there's proper rapport built, and even students are talking and engaging constantly, not these awkward silences. So for Imran, it was very much about engaging in productive discussions that were meaningful and also carefully scaffolded. We also found that really belonging was quite risky and emotional. This was a very embodied act. And for some students, it was quite tricky. It was overwhelming. They felt under pressure to enact a sense of belonging, and often universities sort of maybe unintentionally place that pressure on students. And so we have to be mindful that sometimes students want that sense of safety as well, and that perhaps being challenged to belong might shift them out of that safety zone. For Josie, it was actually wanting safety, but also being pushed a little into that more challenging space. And another quote from Arlene here, she's talking about reaching out, making connections, and how this was, because she was, making an effort herself, that the rewards of that were a sense of belonging for her. But it wasn't until she actually went out of her comfort zone that she managed to do that. So when we looked at the vlogs very closely, we saw that a number of the students very much created safe spaces within their homes, and many of their vlogs were recorded in their bedrooms. And they often had quite deliberate things that they arranged to create that sense of belonging. And I think for myself, Karen and Rola, we felt that maybe this was because so many of them had shifted to online learning, that they had to, in a way, create these artifacts around them, and that these helped them to have that sense of belonging with the university. And it wasn't just, in the home. They often had specific spaces in the university environment that they went to, and they identified that they felt a strong sense of belonging for whatever reason in this particular space or this particular environment. And we became quite interested in what it was that what it was spatially and in terms of these artifacts that really generated this sense of belonging for these particular students. And just some more quotes. We pretty good with the quotes. So the spatial nature of belonging hasn't really been explored in any great depth in research, but understanding how students create these really safe spaces, we felt is really key now for learning and teaching. So it's really important because, I mean, as higher education providers, we've not only got to create safe spaces, as I talked about, but also brave spaces where students feel the safety, if you like, to be brave and to take those risks, as clearly this was something that helped to generate that sense of belonging. And I'll finish up there and I'll pass over to Rola now.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, folks, so my job is to try and wrap this up for you a little bit and kind of talk through some of the discussion points that I think some of this data raises and some of the conversations that we had around this work. I don't know about you, but for me, you know, I kind of start with a concept really excited, and there's a lot of allure to belonging, especially when you think about the wealth of data that links it to success, to well-being and that sort of thing. But the more we talked about it and the more critical we were, it lost a little bit of that shine. But I still think it's actually a concept that's important to think through and work with our students in particular around the university. But we should do that in ways that acknowledge its complexity, that it does belong in different places, in different spaces and in different ways. The student who was homeless, who only had a library space to connect with others from, had a very different experience of belonging from the student who had their room with their objects and their special suit and perfume and internet and printers and all of that jazz that created a really cozy space for them. And so these multiple ways of experiencing it across space and campus and in home environments, I think really challenges this idea that we can actually measure it as a one-off thing once a year and use that in any meaningful way to make decisions. What really fascinated us is, you know, in a lot of rhetoric that we do, we talk about creating belonging for students, and absolutely universities need to create safe spaces, opportunities for connection, opportunities for diversity in the extracurricular, but as well the curriculum. But I think we need to also acknowledge that students themselves have to contribute. They have to do, whether it's through connection and taking risk, whether it's actively contributing, meaningfully participating in extracurricular activities, in mentorship programs, in students as partners programs, that sense of in volunteering. One of our students spoke about volunteering to contribute to policy writing for the university, and for them that really created a sense of belonging. And there were contrasts. So, for example, they could feel a sense of belonging to that particular community, but actually not in their teaching and learning because they couldn't foster those connections with their teachers. But this leap of faith that students talked about, the vulnerability, the risk, we did wonder whether some of that was to do with the whole COVID. You know, these students would have done year 11 and 12, if not before year 10 as well, in lockdown. And so then they've come out, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of challenge and fear about going to university potentially, especially when you think about Deakin students, where we have a really large majority of students who are first in family. And so there's this fear of the unknown on top of the online learning, potentially on top of not meeting many of their peers. And so the need to create, we wondered whether that contributed a little bit to the need to really create safe spaces. And for many students, and especially those with mental health, they really talked about creating that within their own bedrooms. Now, I think, you know, that's important that students can feel safe, but I think for me, the outstanding question here is, how do we create that safety for more students within our teaching and learning environment, particularly online? Because that seemed to be the place where students wouldn't want to turn their videos on, or that they felt maybe perhaps a little bit isolated. And that's not to generalize at all. Many students, actually, some students wanted just to to get in, get out, do what they needed to do, and not engage with other parts of the university because they were time poor and they didn't have the time. But that's different to those who just didn't feel safe or didn't want to take the risk. And so when we look at the literature more broadly, and this is some work with our own colleagues, work done by our own colleagues. So Sarah's research with equity students, they say they consider themselves in a state of in-between, neither belonging to their old lives nor feeling like they belonged at university. And that made us think about the hidden work of belonging, all that extra work of reaching out, of connecting, of things not working, of teachers not replying, and whether that added a burden to some students who perhaps didn't have their safe spaces from which to connect. And then Nicole Crawford's work as well around mature age regional and remote university students who note that the role of safety is also important for their belonging. So again, this idea of safety, again, for people with partial identities, and this is a language that one of our participants used who was part-time, and she never felt she could connect with others during the class because they all knew each other very well because they were doing this cohort thing and she would come in and come out. So recognizing the different ways in which our students want to connect and can connect is really important. And I think we've mentioned this a little bit already, but the increasing rhetoric for everyone to belong comes through. Once some of our students said that they felt they were missing out if they didn't immerse themselves in all the activities. And then there's that risk of them feeling it's their fault if they don't fit in. And so when there's something that happens, like a failure or a major incident, it means that perhaps they're more likely to leave because they're like, what's the point? I don't fit in anyway. Again, I'm not meaning to generalize here. So it really made us question how different students are recognized within our institutional discourses and within what's available institutionally. I think Deakin in general, and I'm only speaking for Deakin here, does really well in its availability of diverse opportunities, and the library spaces in both universities came up as a really important spaces where students could see their own identities reflected, whether it's in the Pride room, whether it's seeing another Black student on campus, whether, it was a mum who went to the library and there were toys for her kid to play with. These were all kind of stories that students shared with us in their own words. And so we see belonging now, it's both, Yuval Davis talks about this, it's both personal and it's always political because there's an us and them. There's a kind of this in between emotions, risk, safety, identity, and inclusion. It's actually really hard to talk about because it's of this liminality, I think, and how strongly connected with student identities. And I really want to just make this point here. This is a study Karen and I were also involved in with another bunch of amazing researchers and colleagues. But here we looked at belonging in academic work, and why I want to raise this is if you look at the academic literature on academic belonging, so this is staff belonging, we actually don't make these grandiose claims about belonging as being this big amorphous thing that is always positive in that literature. In fact, what they talk about more is micro moments of connection, micro moments of meaning. And perhaps that's a better fit for the student data, actually, is to think about just creating multiple moments of connection over time, opportunities, and students may take them up or they might not. And if we then understand a little bit more about what makes spaces safe for students to take up those opportunities, that might actually get us a little bit further. So just to wrap up here, I think it's important to recognize the complexity of belonging in our institutional discourses and the way we talk about it and across trajectories and in different aspects of student journeys. And this is something that students do. We can't guarantee this on their entry into our courses, but we can create opportunities in many diverse ways. what are the next steps for us as a research team? We've got some funding and we're working with the cartoonists, and we're very excited about this, to visualize belonging, to take some of these case studies that we've got, and maybe some stills that we can de-identify from the vlogs, and create those for you as a sector to use in discussion with academics, with support staff, with students themselves, around, the different ways that people can belong, and when there is disconnection, and is that by choice or is that not by choice. There's a little bit more work, I think, for us as researchers that we need to do. I'm really interested in this intersection of safe spaces and inclusive learning environments, and what does that do for belonging, and how do we enable that, I suppose, for very different students, and what forms of not belonging are exclusionary. So this idea of, when is it choice? I'm a mature age student, I don't have time for social connections, but I will connect to ask questions, versus when is it actually a longing, something that we are really missing, and an isolation, and actually something that might be really detrimental and harmful to students. Or the other thing that we didn't talk about today is when belonging is actually more about assimilation, when it's more about just fitting in and losing parts of yourself in order to feel like you belong. So I think there's a bit more work for us to do there. That's the paper that we talked about today. It's in Teaching and Higher Ed, and we have a sister paper that was led by Karen. This was more about space and topologies and belonging, and we talk about discontinuities a little bit more in that paper. And that's it, I think. Happy to share slides, and the recordings will be available, and we are here for questions. Let me just stop sharing.
Well, thank you so much to what a wonderful collection of researches and insights into a really complicated topic. And I really have been observing your questions come in, and I think they really engage beautifully with some of the challenges that Rola, Karen and Sarah are presenting. So let's start with the first one from Robin. Was there a sense of critical timing to develop a sense of belonging? Did you notice that in your data? If you took longer to feel like you connected and fit in, does it make it harder? Anyone want to have a go at that?
I can say something, and I think Sarah wants to say something, and I'm sure Karen does too. I don't think it's linear. I think it was really situated. I mean, students would at the same time feel really strong belonging in one unit of study, or not with their peers, and other times with their sport. That was a real constant. Any combination of things could happen that I personally didn't notice any trends, but in saying that, also the research was not longitudinal.
Sarah, did you want to add?
Look, yeah, only really to echo what Rola is saying. I think what the three of us really wanted to do in this research was really to reject this idea that belonging can be a metric, that it's something that we can measure at a point in time, and that universities can point to and say, hey, we've got students have a great sense of belonging or engagement. And so, we found that it was, as Rola said, not non-linear. It was so variable. It was very fluid, and multiple. There was multiple topologies of belonging. Yeah.
Karen, did you want to add anything else?
I won't on this one. Thanks, Margaret. It's been said too beautifully already.
So next question from Dave Bowd. One of the greatest exposures of students to the institution, the discipline, staff and others is through the course units. How would you communicate the implications of your finding to the unit chair with the 400 students who refused to engage with queries from the quoted student and is clearly contributing to a non-belonging environment?
I'm just digesting the question.
Yeah.
It's got a few different elements of it.
relational pedagogies as a starting point.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I think, you know, my experience with students is that it's often very small things that make an enormous difference to their student experience. And I think sometimes academics tend to overthink. You know, they think, well, I can't possibly be guiding and mentoring 400 students. So I actually think it's about reassuring academics that, you know, there's often very small ways that can engender connection without necessarily being you know, equal across 400, because of the 400, there might only be 10% that actually need that type of ongoing engagement to create that sense of belonging. A lot of them won't need it, and so I think it's a case more of reassuring academics that it's not going to be that time consuming, but equally, you know, as Rola and Karen mentioned, you know, it's about relationality and making small connections that make such a huge difference to the students.
I think I was.
Karen.
Oh, sorry.
No,
I think I was interested in the complexity of that question, because I completely agree with what Sarah was saying. There's lots of ways we can communicate our findings. So, for example, with a teacher or an academic, I would talk about the things that they might like to think about, and one of those might be having conversations with students about the nuances of belonging, how it's completely normal and expected that they would experience the university and the course in different ways, that they might connect to some parts and not other parts, that actually there's multiple ways to engage with the course in the university, and it's okay if they feel differently from their peers, and to actually get them to think about that and have those conversations about belonging and non-belonging and how belonging is made. But I think the challenge with that question is that we were talking about this, the teacher who's actually doesn't want to engage, if I've understood correctly, and isn't interested in engaging with relational pedagogies or thinking about meaningful experiences for the students. So I guess that's a wider sort of institutional issue. At my university, we have we're paying a lot of attention to developing teaching. And we have a number of ways in which we're encouraging teachers to develop their practice and take these ideas seriously. But it sounded like there was sort of an additional issue with that particular teacher not really being interested in their role in actually effective teaching, which is sort of, an added layer there.
I wondered if it was a little less mysterious. I mean, in that, I'm just reading it off your quote. Sometimes I think, and this is just, I'm adding my two bobs here, which is not research-based at all, but please forgive me, that we think we don't incorporate in the universities enough emphasis on how logistics actually pan out. Emails are missed, queries are missed, you have to hand in queues to get your student ID. And I wonder if there's also something about how the way the work is like those, a little bit what Sarah's saying, those things aren't seen as important, or maybe people are just overwhelmed. So I actually think for such a question, it's actually surprisingly complex. There's so many different ways you could pick at it.
Margaret, it's true. You think about these institutions, they're big behemoths, 60,000 students, 10,000 staff. I mean, we have a whole city kind of arrangement, village, whatever arrangement, and yet somehow we have to communicate and have understanding and connection and relationality. And whilst we can do that on the human front, I think some of the touch points through the LMS, through email, they can be really tricky to navigate and maneuver, and the bureaucracy can make it really can disconnect people. I think it's not what Dave's getting at. I mean, to your answer, Dave, I totally agree with Sarah. I think students sometimes don't want a lot. They want assessment information to be consistent and not contradictory. They want teachers to respond to them. They want a bit of connection. They don't, and they want course designs that are stimulating in some way, and some sort of interest that captures some interest to them.
But just to add on to that, I think for me what was actually a really uplifting and sort of positive about the research was the multiplicity of ways that our students were telling us that they made and curated their own belonging. So we often think about belonging just as being what the teacher does, and the onus and the pressure placed upon the teacher to answer every email and, you know, create these fantastic belonging environments. I noticed you use that phrase, belonging environments. But actually what we found from the research was that belonging environments were not just in the teacher's hand to create, and students were, you know, for some students belonging was just having a comfy chair and a warm space to work, whereas for other students it was engaging in a student staff partnership. For others it was doing some mentoring or being part of a society. So the multiplicity and plurality and complexity of belonging for me is actually kind of liberating and exciting, and opens up opportunities, I think, as well as makes things messier. It does make things messier, but it's also maybe a good mess.
It's kind of yeah, it's interesting to hear both the excitement and challenge sort of running through the whole piece. And here's and I think the questions really reflect that. So here's another question which sort of segues a little bit from the notion of the environment and what it is that we do on our side. It makes me wonder whether the barrier is still present, writes Elizabeth Hitches, in many education environments, e.g. not having timely access to accessible documents, not always having options to engage in learning which supports students' individual needs, might also contribute to that feeling of not belonging. That sense of this environment is designed with or without people like me in mind. I wonder if you've come across any experiences particular to students with disability and the impact of inclusion or non-inclusive spaces.
I'll just jump in very quickly. I think Rola and Sarah might want to say more about this, but absolutely, yeah. I mean, a resounding theme from the research was the materiality of belonging, how belonging was made, felt and experienced in connection to material spaces, objects and things. You know, it wasn't just a cognitive internal experience. It was very much connected to the ways in which we interact with our environment and the affordances of those environments, which then leads to necessary questions about who has the ability or the opportunity to curate and create their spaces, who has access to the resources that they feel they need to feel comfortable and to feel that they can learn. And while I don't want to head down the route of encouraging, you know, increasing personalisation, there was a real theme of students wanting to curate spaces and environments in the ways in which supported their learning. But I think Rola and Sarah might want to say more about this disability question that you mentioned there.
Elizabeth, I've just put a paper in, and this is the work of USO, and that one was specifically at students with disabilities, a disability and their belonging in university. I think it really does. I mean, if you think about students, and this is from other research we've done that Joe led around assessment, you know, the student who, for any time she has to do an exam, has to go online and look up, are there stairs? Can I get up the stairs? Is then put in a separate room to do the exam, which stigmatizes her. And then, but it doesn't actually support the, but it doesn't actually make the assessment inclusive, even though there was an adjustment and accommodation. What it did is actually just other her compared to her peers, who then would say, well, why were you in this other room? What's so special about you, sort of thing. So I do think and I think in that paper, Yusso talks about ableism and as a mechanism for actually excluding students and making them feel like they don't belong. So whether inclusive spaces might enable more of that, certainly the diversity of spaces. And actually, we did have students with ADHD, and who said that being able to use the rooms in the library and to use them in different ways really suited their purposes, to be able to study in a quiet space in the library where they knew they were safe. That really created a sense of belonging for them. So yeah.
Fantastic. I'm noticing, Sarah, did you want to add or no?
Not really. I think Karen and Rola have summed up that really well. We've got quite a few questions as well
to get through. Indeed, and we may not get through them all, but we'll do our best. I'm actually going to draw close to the formal proceedings right now. It's 6:58, and I think we'll keep on going. I reckon we've got a lot to keep on going for a while, and some really interesting questions out there. But I'd just like to take a moment for us all to thank Karen, Sarah and Rola for a fabulous presentation, and I think for really sort of exposing I don't want to say the underbelly, because that sounds like it's something that is, or exposed, but just sort of opening up a conversation that I think really deserves to be had, and who better to have it with than the three of you. So thank you very much, and a wonderful end to our CRADLE Seminar Series. So with the thank yous coming in and lots of clapping and cheering on the chat, I'm going to keep on asking some questions. And there's David Galani's asked this question. It's also a little bit related to what Helena asked. I think was very much one of the first questions. So I'll start with Helena's and then I'll move backwards. Fascinating work about the complexity of belonging. Question is, how can universities support or facilitate this, or should universities have to? And this is what David wrote. I think the points your paper raises about politics and the wider systemic issues in our societies being linked to belonging is so important. However, I also think it's important not to downplay or lose individual student agency when it comes to belonging. Do you see this as a spectrum? I.e., is the individual student or institution responsible for student belonging? And if so, are you suggesting we need to put more onus on the university taking responsibility? So I guess this is a question about that sort of interrelationship. The big stuff out there, the stuff in here, and the institution.
I have a few things I want to say. Can I jump in first? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great point that really comes to the heart of what we've been thinking about, I think. So for me, the research showed and suggested that belonging is very much relational and multiple. So absolutely, I'm actually concerned by increasing pressure being placed on universities and individual teachers to be somehow responsible for achieving somehow what I perceive to be an impossible, finite, fixed sense of belonging for their students. I'm thinking, and the research was suggesting and depicting, that belonging is much more multiply experienced in different ways. So you might experience one sense of belonging to a peer group. You might not perhaps feel a sense of belonging to a society. You might experience a sense of belonging at some times during your course and at other times. So in that way, belonging is very much relational. It's a connection between students, teachers, students and peers, things, spaces. It's fluid and in flux. And I think for those reasons, we need to have conversations with our students about how they can think about belonging in complex ways, and not be troubled if they don't come to university and experience the belonging utopia that perhaps they might wish, and it's not some sort of ongoing, enduring sense of well-being. Because if we think about belonging, and if we think about our own senses of belonging, connections with our own institutions, we probably wouldn't expect, as Rola made that point, we probably wouldn't expect that sort of finite sense of wonder that's perhaps being attributed to it. So if we think about our own senses of belonging, we think about the effective atmospheres challenges and the complexity and the mobility of that feeling, of that sensation, we're sort of a little bit more comfortable with that. So I think having discussions with students about that is really important. But at the same time, having discussions about how, if they feel excluded, there are multiple ways to engage and belong, and there are things that they can do, and there are people that they can speak to and reach out. There's activities that they can get involved in, and universities need to continue their fantastic work that they've been doing over recent years to provide multiple opportunities for students to engage in diverse ways. At the same time, I think teachers and educators need to talk to students about how sometimes we all might choose not to belong, and we might not feel excluded, but perhaps we're a commuter student, or we have young children and we need to actually get home, and we can't engage in all of the opportunities, and we can't or don't want to belong to particular spaces, places and activities, and that's okay as well. So I think a message of diversity and nuance coming from teachers and educators in conversations with their students would be really, really helpful.
I just, oh, sorry.
Go, Sarah. No, go, Sarah.
I just had a very small point to add, and it really just it follows on from what Karen is saying. I mean, this pressure for universities to sort of enact this belonging and create this belonging, I think that's what we were wanting to unpack, if you like. And if you look at the Student Experience Survey, which is, our national survey here in Australia for our UK colleagues, I mean, one of the questions on that is asking students quite clearly, did you have a sense of belonging to your institution? So what we're trying to do with this research is actually trouble that sort of very simplified way of measuring something that clearly, as the students articulated, it can't be measured in that linear I do, I don't sort of way. So that's sort of where we sit in this.
I was gonna just one last point, and it's around staff belonging and how disenfranchised staff are feeling potentially, and especially sessional staff. And I'd hate to put that work back onto them, who are, when they might be really precarious and feel hard done by their university. I think there's something around talking about belonging. And I noticed one of the questions was around care, and did students talk about care? I mean, when we think about it relationally, it's not just about students in the center, it's actually about care and belonging for all of us. The micro moments of meaning, or micro moments of joy, or micro moments of connection, those things also, the spaces for staff, where are they for them to connect? So it kind of this complex ecosystem, and I think I've gone off on a tangent, but the issue of care and who provides the care, I mean, it is such a gendered word. We didn't really talk about care in our research, and the students didn't, but when we published this paper, one of the reviewers asked about mattering, and Strayhorn talks about belonging as a form of mattering. And that's about students feeling like they matter, but also recognizing that it comes through the materials, and everything is connected in that way. So the students talked about feeling that they matter, and like we said, the purpose, feeling that they had a purpose, or they could connect to a bigger goal. That was something that really came through. I'm not sure that care did very much in our data.
I think that you're referring to the question about a duty of care too, measures contributing to duty of care, similar, different to measures of creating belonging. And that's a slightly different question. But I'll hold off on that in a moment, because what I'd like to ask, because there are two questions that are really similar around this point. I'm intrigued about this intentional resistance to belonging. Why would students not want to belong? Is it due to feeling like an outsider? And then there's some chat about that. And then that's from Claire Shannon. And then Marie asks a little further down a question about the demographic breakdown. Could there be any patterns in who, where, how, depending on gender, race, class, about first and family? And as a related question, so all these things are related, Karen talked about some forms of not belonging in political acts. Is there more that can be said there? So this is a question really about not belonging and the relationship through patterns, and then when is not belonging positive and to whom does that apply? So I've thrown all of that together for you because you seem to be very good at managing these threads. So hopefully it will work.
I'll have a go. I'm slightly overwhelmed by that multiple questions.
So sorry, start with non-belonging.
Yeah,
Start with non-belonging, and then maybe if you can connect that to patterns, that would be great. Sorry, that was my bad long question.
Fine. So the question of when would when would not belonging be desirable? I mean, for example, that example we gave earlier about the mature age student who has multiple caring responsibilities and lots of work, and the idea of going out, in the evening for a society event is prohibitive because they just don't have the time. Now, there's two ways you could. Some students said, well, they felt they were really missing out, but other students said, well, it's not for me. I don't need to do that. I'm here for the academic side, and that's what I'm here for. I think some online students, and I can't remember if this study or another study really talked about feeling like much of the society work and the extracurricular work happened on campus and they couldn't contribute in the same way because not as many events were held online. What the literature also suggests is that, for example, lots of events happen in pubs, there's alcohol, and that's not an inclusive environment for all students, and it makes some students uncomfortable. And so they might choose to not attend those, and that's okay. They find alternative activities that they might be involved in. So that comes to that idea of when would not belonging be a good thing. And I think those are some examples where it doesn't resonate with shared interests or shared values.
And does anyone...
Look, I was going to just talk a little bit about the paper that Karen referred to around the success study, when we asked, myself and Janine asked students about what success meant for them. And in there, we found that there was one of the very strong themes that came out was a resistance to defining success the way meritocratic way of defining it. So, for an example of a quote was, success is not getting good marks and having 2.5 children. And the reason I mention that is I think there's a certain that's what really why we call this the politics of belonging, because some of these students, this was quite deliberate. They wanted to disrupt dominant discourses. They didn't want to be, in terms of the success, they didn't want to be defined by what the university or the dominant ideologies, if you like, were defining them. And we found a similar thing with belonging. Some of these students resisted being, in terms of how the university or the broader sort of educational landscape defined belonging. They didn't want to subscribe to that particular definition. So we found that really interesting. And it gives us more food for thought, so that's just my perspective. But over to you, Karen, if you've got anything to add. You're nodding.
I agree completely. And I think it is really interesting we need to unpack more the difference between when belonging practices are exclusionary and when that's the problem, and when students are, deliberately and quite rightly making a legitimate choice that they don't identify with that identity or that particular practice or that particular space for belonging that's been created. I think one of our participants said something like, well, that's just like, I tried a society, but they weren't my kind of people, so I didn't feel a sense of belonging there, and that was completely okay. And I think it leads on to sort of interconnects with broader questions about where is the university, which we're grappling with now, with more blended and hybrid learning, more commuter students and more diverse ways to engage, the boundaries between the campus and connecting with in-person societies, and who is a student and how students choose to engage and curate their university experience is diversifying. And I think this leads us to necessarily need to think about diverse conceptions of engagement as well.
And I'm going to push you on that second part of that question that I've all managed to mush together, which is about the different demographics, gender, race, class. You've spoken about them a bit, but I was wondering if you wanted to draw any direct lines there in terms of the political act of not belonging, particularly.
I don't know about if I can draw anything around gender, race, class specifically. I can talk about students with mental health who talked about their mental health and really spoke about wanting to feel safe and perhaps not reaching out, and that for them it was really risky to reach out. So that was I'm struggling a little because I think in qualitative research and with so few students, it's really hard to talk about clear-cut connections, but also because it is so intersectional and dynamic. But I feel like there's something going on there for the students with mental health challenges and their sense of being able to connect and also wanting to be safe and that challenge there for them. The other group were the ones with real caring responsibilities, and I'm not going to say only women. I think it's maturer age students spoke a lot more about being very strategic in where they spent their time, because they were very time poor and they had different priorities. And so we had a couple of younger students in residential who were really just wanting to make friends and have that real social connection, whereas, and I don't want to generalize because it's not the same for all mature age students, but if I'm thinking about trends, some of them really talked about being strategic, engaging where they needed to be, reaching out to teachers for questions or their peers, and that was it. They weren't in it for the social. Although I think one student did say she was surprised. She did make a friend and it surprised her, and she was very happy that it did happen. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if others would have thought there's more to say about gender and race. We didn't set out to study that, to be honest. We kind of left it to students to share with us and the identities that emerged around their sexuality, around they're feeling comfortable because there's other people of color, or they're being a mum. Those examples kind of just rose because the students just shared them with us and they felt it was important. So we didn't set out collecting all our students' demographics up front because we wanted to see what they would say.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Rola. Just to follow on, I actually think on memory quite early on in the research, we decided, because of the complexity of the methodology, we were asking students to make vlogs, which in itself is, it was something that we all wanted to do. But it did mean that we were, somewhat limited because it was a time commitment for the students. And then we also asked if we could do a follow-up interview, or, they could just choose to do an interview. And I should have mentioned right at the beginning, I saw there was a question in there. The data was collected from the UK and Australia. I'm sorry, I think I omitted to say that. And we had a total of 30 students, so 15 in Australia and 15 in the UK. And so I also think one of the reasons that we didn't adopt this equity lens, if you like, was because it is different across the two countries. There are nuances to student cohort groups. There's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences. For example, Karen mentioned commuter students in the UK, which I know is a group that it traditionally sort of is looked at in terms of, if you want, for want of a better word, equity prerogatives. But in Australia, we don't really consider commuter students, because most of our students are commuter students. So we decided that because of the two geographic locations, putting another lens of equity on top of what we were trying to do would probably not be appropriate in such a small study.
Thank you. And And actually, I went ahead and checked out that question. The question was also whether international students as well, slightly different from where they were located. So in that cohort, were there people who were neither, who travelled or who were enrolled from outside the UK and Australia?
Did we have international students in this study, Karen? We did.
Yeah, we did. But as Rola and Sarah were explaining, we didn't specifically collate that data. That wasn't in such a small sample. We were just interested in the richness of individual student stories.
So I'll move on with the questions as they are back to the top. And since my previous attempt at trying to mush questions together worked poorly, I'm actually going to just ask the questions as read.
You can put it on us, Margaret, the time of day as opposed to your ability.
It's all either far too early or far too late. Did the idea or need for code switching, given that we've talked about, you didn't really say this is this sort of student or not, but in the data you might have picked up some of this idea of code switching arise in your conversations with students as they move between modes of belonging?
I don't think it was a big feature in our data. Certainly, the data that looks at race and marginalized students in the academy, they talk about code switching. I think your previous research, Sarah, where they said they didn't fit in either here or there, it indicates that there might have been some need to shift who they are to try and fit into the university structure. But I don't know that came through very much in our research.
Yeah, I think the study you're talking about, where I talk about in-between spaces, where, students reflected on, and these were students from equity backgrounds, having to move between different spaces and having to do, I think the person who asked the question talked about code switching, and that came across in a different research, in a different project that I was involved in. Yeah.
Thank you. And then now to a really big question. What does belongingness tell us about the power structures in higher education?
That they like to measure things.
Yeah, and that we still got a top-down approach. I know there was a comment in the chat. Someone said, how lovely it was to have research centered on student voice and having the students actually at the center of the research. And I know both Karen and Rola and myself feel very strongly about that, So, we can't really decide, or we can't really, as institutions, we really need to foreground what the students think rather than what, the institutions or the structures dictate.
Yeah, and I just add, I think it sort of taps into a wider concern, doesn't it, that I'm sure many of us share in higher education and universities, sort of love of buzzwords and love of sort of taking concepts somewhere away from perhaps their original starting point. And I think something to think about for all of us is how we can make spaces for complex conversations that don't reduce the multiplicity of students' experiences, and actually, handle complex ideas like this with care, so that they're still useful. I mean, I still believe, I think we all came away with the belief that belonging is still a really useful concept, still a really meaningful idea to think with in terms of supporting students. But I think we need to handle it with care, and not be afraid to actually say that this is a little bit more complex, a little bit more nuanced than perhaps we might like, ideally, and it can't be simplified and shouldn't be simplified, because that might then actually be the opposite of what we're trying to achieve and lead to exclusionary effects.
I'm going to follow up with a comment that was just made in the chat. Do you think measurement's ever important? What about how do we, there's something pragmatic there about being able to measure things as well, and that it is, if it is the things that universities like to do, if it is the currency in which we operate, how do we navigate that tension? The things that we want to, the things that are immeasurable are the most important, but unless we measure them, then we can't get purchase in the sector.
I think I would respond to saying that I absolutely agree that we need to engage with these ideas. We need to think about them. We need to attend to them. We need to make them what I like what Latour talks about. He talks about thinking about complex ideas as a matter of concern. So looking at something with care and concern and attention, paying attention to that idea, to the complexity and multiplicity of that idea. But I would I don't think I'd feel comfortable with a numerical or quantitative measurement on something as nuanced and sociological as belonging. For me, that's why this idea of belonging as a matter of concern in all its richness and plurality would be more meaningful.
I mean, David, if I'm being super pragmatic, I might come around to there might be value in it, but I think what you're talking about there is these scales that recognize multidimensionality and acknowledge, perhaps give a bit of context around who, when, why, how. They might actually give us something. But I think in our course experience questionnaire, it's a single question that says, do you feel like you belong at the university? And I wonder what meaning we can derive from that, if and I agree with Karen there. Perhaps there's other questions that we could pop in that might give us better insight, especially as this notion of the university is so amorphous, like we just said, and in contradiction to the idea of belonging being really situated. And I wonder whether that comes from the US, where the culture of, this idea of belonging to the university is actually perhaps more stronger, at least from what you see in the movies and the TV shows, but the branding as well, and the mugs and the gifts and the, and the legacy students, so many legacy students, for first and family students, or, any of our other students here in Australia. And maybe the group of 8 would argue differently, but where was I going with this? I think it's not, and with the hybrid stuff, the question, do you feel like you belong at university, perhaps is a bit too big.
And I think, could I just jump in one tiny point? I just wanted to say as well, I think for me, the research with the students really exploded the idea as well, because when the students were telling us that for one student, say, belonging was engagement in a particular project, for one it was a peer group, for one it was their course, another it was their bedroom and the things in their bedroom. I'm thinking then that the assumption that we're all speaking the same language when we talk about these ideas, that's inherent in those kinds of binary, do or don't questions, is an issue as well that needs to be unpacked.
We're almost at the close, and I think that everyone, it's been very rich, but I think there's time for one more question. That's what I'm trying to say. So, and it's going to be a fairly swift one, and this is the one that took my fancy. What role do narratives that are embedded in place play in forming student belonging? And I'm going to leave that question. It goes on a little bit, but I think I'll just pose that piece and just ask each of you to comment on it, and then we'll wrap up. I'll start with Sarah, and then roll out, and Karen, you get the last word.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a narrative researcher, so I just think that narratives are key, because, it allows us insight into the lived experience of what constitutes life, recognizing that there are multiple realities, multiple lived experiences, and there's no one true picture of what's out there. So for me, narratives related to belonging, I think, would really indicate the nuances and the diversity of this state.
Sorry, I'm going to be really frank. I just saw Joe's baby Patrick watching our seminar and just had a moment. It was very cute. What Sarah was saying, I'm a qualitative researcher as well. I think narrative gives us insight. the power of stories. And I think that's why it was in our title, and maybe we should have come back to it at the end and really highlighted it. It gives us in a window, just a glimmer or a glimpse into the student life, and maybe that stops us from making assumptions about what it is or doesn't, what is good or isn't good for them, and instead means we can meet them where they are, meet them in the middle, or wherever, you know, that's the relational piece, and that's the piece that matters. And I think that's what this whole research is about, is that students are respected and valued, and we do that by understanding their own stories and narratives. So I do think it really matters.
Right.
I just want to give a slightly different answer. I completely agree with those points, but I think we also need to think about the narratives and the dominant discourses that shape students' thinking, and shape our thinking, and that circulate and impact. So, for example, in our study, one particular student was talking about how they were really uncomfortable about the idea of belonging. They found it kind of almost upsetting, because for them, they had been automatically assigned predicted grades as an entry point to university, as a result of the pandemic. And so they had some kind of imposter syndrome issues about whether they had rightfully secured their place to study in higher education. When they arrived at university, they were surrounded by conversations or promotion materials about developing a sense of belonging, and they found it really uncomfortable. And I think we need to also look at the narratives and dominant discourses around singular senses of belonging and how these are shaping students and staff thinking, in order to problematize those a little bit and look at the unintended consequences that sometimes those kinds of narratives have.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thanks to you all. All the best for the festive season, and we'll see you all in 2024. Thank you so much, Rolla, Karen and Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.